Jack.
Levi.
The book club from hell.
Hello everyone, this is Jack with the Book Club from Hell, the mouthpiece of a revolutionary vanguard party peopled with only the most biologically degenerate specimens imaginable. Do you ever get the feeling that the world is getting worse and worse? A sense of inexorable creeping decay? A burning in the pit of your stomach? The blinding fear of entropy's implacable advance? Don't worry, it isn't just your mental illness speaking. This is how the world really is. Or at least, according to Spandrell, a pseudonymous online thinker whose only available biographical information is on his website, spandrell.com. I am a European man living in Asia who blogs about the past and future of civilization. His work, published on spandrell.com, on Twitter and on Urbit, has been variously described as reactionary, neo-reactionary, or even full reactionary. He's best known for his theory of biological Leninism, a conceptual framework which describes the inexorable decline of the West. Basically, a progressive Leninist vanguard party is formed in a decentralised manner, attracting the lowest status members of Western society with the promise of higher status. For Spandrell, these low status members of society are the biologically inferior, those who would be low status no matter their social context, that is, outside of a bioleninist political milieu. There's plenty more to this guy's worldview. The need for a new religion to be developed, status point theory, point deer, make horse, IQ shredders, signalling spirals. If any of this sounds interesting, check his blog out, after, of course, finishing this episode, preferably multiple times. So listeners, make yourselves comfortable with the revolution, which is already underway. You can't fight it, you can't stop it. So sit back, relax, and enjoy.
Those types of who's that guy? There's like the decline of the West. Aren't you reading a book about by that guy?
Spengler. He's pretty different to Spengler. I'd say I'm enjoying Spengler a lot more than I enjoyed Spandrell's 3 essays on bioleninism, or the core tenets of bioleninism.
But I guess what I'm saying is like there's this there's this thing like Marx does it as well. Hegel did it, like trying to understand some sort of quote unquote law or invariant material or economic cause or driver of history, and using that to predict the future, like large scale political future. And in particular, it always seems as though it has to do with like the collapse of Western civilization or whatever. Like, and there's lots of different ways of coming at it, whether it's like Spengler or Bloody Shovel stuff or Marx or whoever, you know, or like CRT stuff has it.
I would say people trying to prognosticate based on historical trends or trying to pick out particular things from history that they think will determine our future is pretty common. Many of them, though, don't. I think many do have an apocalyptic bent to them. It seems almost an eschatological discipline, but that's not all of them. I think many liberal ones, the sort of people who believe in this idea of progress as an irreversible trend, are almost universally triumphalist about it. Many of them have this fundamental belief that progress moves in one direction.
That's a really good point. Yeah. Or
even that progress is a thing that exists in history.
Yeah, there's two ways to think about it, optimism versus pessimism about the future, but in either sense, it's like, will the future be better than the present or the past? And the pessimist says it will be worse, and the optimist says it will be better. But they're both wrong if their explanations are kind of deterministic. If they're saying yes, it will be, you know, because they're making
this is also a bit of a cop out, but saying it's going to be better or worse is a bit low resolution. The better or worse by which measures? Yes, it's going to be different. And there are going to be certain things, I'm sure, in 20 years that I'll like more than now, and certain things I'll like less.
Yeah, so like the progressives...
It's going to be better doesn't really tell you much.
the progressives are kind of implicitly saying the world will be better in the ways that I think are good.
Yeah. The world will more closely resemble my headcanon for how planet Earth is supposed to go.
Yeah, exactly. My vision of the Great Society. So, anyways, back to Spandrell more generally. So he's basically trying to give this broader. He has some really interesting ideas. I'll just go through the dot points of them. It's really good. There's only like 5 of them. But he one of his ideas is that basically the loss of religion in the West, and we need to replace it with a new religion. He's got this thing which comes up a lot. So the new religion idea doesn't feature much in biological Leninism, but he's got this thing called status point theory, which we can unpack in a little bit. But it's basically that like the primary driver of human behavior is essentially chasing status.
Yeah, and that features a bit in the bioleninism essays, but it's not. He doesn't go into it much. He just says part of the reason why Leninism's so effective is that it offers status to low status people, and status is important, and that's about as far as he goes.
I would say it might be the primary like causal mechanism in his argument.
Yeah, I should say actually, he doesn't. So I disagree with his overall thesis, but he says plenty of things that are worth considering. Like, I don't think reading this was a complete waste of time.
No, unlike some of the stuff that
unlike plenty of... You don't want to read Call the Crocodile again?
Please. I'm only going to read Call of F. Gardner just for the lols, but purely self-flagellatory lols, not because I actually think it's worth reading.
It's going to be like chewing broken glass.
Listeners, we had a discussion yesterday about our
earlier
content.
Today, my time.
Well, earlier today for Jack's time. About content going forward for 2023, and I basically said to Jack, I'm like, I can't do fiction.
Levi just vetoed fiction.
With some caveats, and one of the caveats was like, if it's a really good book, so we're going to do Atlas Shrugged. Well, Jack doesn't think it's a good book, but like if it's a fiction
I don't think it's a bad book. I just think it's a solid
reading.
6.5 out of 10 book that goes on for way too long.
But I did also make another exception, which was I would read Call of F. Gardner if he wants to.
So you've said you don't want to read fiction. So your 2 exceptions are an 1,100-page book that really could be like 300 pages, and F. Gardner's book that he wrote in 8 days and probably didn't edit. I'll be doing solo episodes on fiction.
Yeah, except for the occasional head fuck for Levi. So anyways, we needed a new religion. Status points are awesome. His other point is Islam, which he doesn't like Islam, basically. Then another
particularly
thing...
Sunni Islam.
In particular? Yeah.
Yeah, in particular.
I didn't read
so
enough
he
on
feels that
Islam.
in Sunni Islam, the absence of a figure like an Ayatollah means that it has a, similar to bioleninism, a constant leftward ratchet of leaders appealing to inferior or low status members of society to bring them over to their cause, which leads to increasing extremism with no upper limit. That mental model might make more sense to listeners once they've finished the episode and really understand the depths of biological Leninism, why Spandrell trusts Shiites more than Sunnis.
Another thing that he talks about is point dear make horse, which is essentially just getting people to believe absurd things. It's like cultural scrambling. Signaling spirals, which is, I mean, it's pretty self-explanatory.
Yes.
IQ shredders, which is a funny one, which is basically like the destruction of human intelligence by basically smart people going to cities. So the city is the IQ shredder, and then not having children. So all the smart people are basically not having children, and all the dumb people are having kids. So we're just going to like become a dumb species. And then his final thing is biological.
That's to some extent true in that birth rate drops with increasing education until you get to postgraduate degrees, and then it increases again.
Really? I didn't know.
Yeah.
That. That's an interesting point.
You get a bit of a bump once you get your PhD or MD or whatever. So it's
I want to have like
causally
12
related,
kids.
people. If you want more children, you better stay at university for a long time. Don't worry about things like having sex. Just get those degrees, and then you'll probably just get pregnant once you're conferred with the degree. I don't know how this works.
Even then, don't have sex. Just go to a sperm
just
bank
don't do it. Just acquire more degrees, and eventually
acquire more degrees.
You'll have the immaculate conception of your 6th doctoral thesis or something like that.
And just come into turkey bases and just run around, just injecting people with your sperm.
That's how we'll solve the demographic crisis.
And then he's saved civilization with turkey bases.
Mandatory postgraduate education.
Bunch of overly educated men running around the street with a lukewarm cum in
turkey basters,
turkey basters, assaulting people.
Just the runoff of the cum tributes to Xi Jinping. Anyway, I think at some point we were meaning to discuss what biological.
And then his final major concept is what we're covering today in depth, which is biological Leninism. So I won't go into that now because we're going to spend the next however long talking about it. But yeah, so these are the major, I guess, parts of his not ideology, his ideascape that explain why Western civilization is collapsing.
Yeah, and I'll include a link to this guy's blog in the show notes. Whether it stays online or not, whether he completely moves to Urbit or something like that, I can't guarantee. But at least while it's functional, it's pretty fun to flick through his blog posts. He's got a lot of them, and the comments section is pretty wild. The comments section really is just people who agree with him fairly uncritically, just coming into each other's mouths, into their own, just aggressively agreeing with each other.
I avoided reading the comments.
I live for that.
I was like, the comments are going to be total trash. All right, let me read one comment.
They're to their credit, they're mostly properly spelled and punctuated, which is better than 99% of the internet.
Yeah. That's a good. That's a good.
Bloody Shovel is attracting the creme de la creme of frog posters.
I think that our Discord's not too bad when it comes to spelling and punctuation.
Our Discord is impeccable. There is nothing I will say against our Discord. Everyone on it's a champion.
Shout out to the Discord. You guys are awesome.
Shout out to Name, who seems to spam about 50 pages of notes on...
Name is a fucking animal. Names.
Yeah, Name is just an animal when it comes to reading books and making notes on them. Anyway.
So this is one of the funny things about the Discord. Like, sometimes I don't necessarily post, but I'll read stuff. And it's really cool to see that people are starting to just engage with each other. But some of the stuff that gets posted is serious reading, serious content. Does Names have a blog? He should write a blog, man.
Yeah, he really should. Or he can just keep posting stuff to our Discord, and that's good too.
Okay, so where should we start? So that's the problem that he's trying to solve, which is why is Western civilization collapsing, and where is it going, and how is that collapse happening?
Let's first define Leninism, because he doesn't really define Leninism, and his definition of Leninism is somewhat different to, I think, the more commonly accepted definition. So, for example, Marxism doesn't really come into his definition of Leninism, whereas to most people, Leninism is a subset of Marxism. So very basically, Leninism's a form of Marxism. So he believed that bourgeois capitalism represented a stage of history preceding socialism, which preceded communism. And capitalism had served its purpose, although at various points in his career, Lenin also seemed to indicate that you could skip the capitalist stage of history in Russia. And you wanted to get to communism. That's the really good state of society. It's a utopia where things like class will melt away, national boundaries will melt away, the state will melt away. We'll live in a paradise. Where Leninism departs from other forms of Marxism, or the forms of Marxism that preceded it, was in Lenin's idea of forming a vanguard party. So, to Lenin, the way that you can get to a workers' revolution against feudalism or capitalism is to form a vanguard of the proletariat. And this would be a small party of really, really dedicated people recruited from the working classes who will agitate on behalf of the proletariat, and they'll institute the dictatorship of the proletariat, which is part of socialism preceding communism, on behalf of the proletariat. And this is as opposed to revolution through something like trade unions, for example, as syndicalists would prefer versus Leninists. And then from Leninism, you got further offshoots like Stalinism and Trotskyism. And what Spandrell talks about in some ways more resembles Stalinism in its bureaucracy than it does Leninism, although it departs from Leninism in many other ways, in that he doesn't ever really discuss Marxism, apart from a brief mention of cultural Marxism, a buzzword that I find frequently bandied about in more right-wing spaces, which I'm still not quite sure what it means. I've never really seen it very well defined anywhere. Importantly for the understanding of bioleninism is basically this formation of a vanguard party from members of society who are lower status, who wish for a revolution so that they can get higher status. That's, at least to my mind, the kernel of Leninism that Spandrell has taken and then made biological in bioleninism. Does that sound about right to you? His definition of Leninism is slightly different.
Do I even agree with what he's... Okay. So I think what you said, I'm not like... I'm not super well versed in the different strands or descendants of Marxism.
The different subgenres of Marx core.
Different subgenres. So you like I don't know if I can necessarily add anything there. I'll take you, like, it sounds reasonable what you just said. He kind of the word biological Leninism just seems like an inappropriate thing to call it. What he's talking about.
I think it's a tagline that's very catchy. As I alluded to earlier, most of why I ended up looking more into this guy was because biological Leninism sounds so ridiculous. And I expect in large part he picked the Leninism part of biological Leninism because it sounds snappy and it's eye-catching. And look, I was going to say intriguing. Maybe to a particular type of person it's intriguing what biological Leninism is. I'm not sure it was selected because it closely resembles Leninism.
Is he grasping for straws? Okay, I'm going to be generous and not go straight.
I don't think he's totally grasping for straws.
I won't go straight to... Once we explain it a bit, it'll become obvious, hopefully, why he's done that. I disagree with it, but I'll kind of give him poetic license.
Levi's become an avowed bioleninist as a result of these 3 blog posts.
So it's mainly to do with the dictatorship by some sort of underclass, essentially. And Lenin sort of, I guess what he's saying, correct me if you think I'm wrong, but what Spandrell's saying is like, essentially, what he calls classical Leninism or Russian Leninism or formal Leninism was essentially the explicit revolutionary organized form of proletariat dictatorship. And biological Leninism is essentially the same way, is essentially like a different method for getting to the same outcome. So a dictatorship by the underclass, or what they interestingly call the kakistocracy.
Yeah, the kakistocracy, the rule by the least qualified to rule,
which under classical Leninism is achieved explicitly through like essentially revolution, and biological Leninism ends up with a kakistocracy, except it's via a very different mechanism. And like the biological part of that is his explanation of how we end up like that. And basically, the West is achieving gradually kakistocracy and Leninism via a different mechanism.
Yeah, so what he says one insight of Lenin's was, and I don't know if Lenin explicitly said this. I've read the April theses and what is to be done, but that was a while ago. So I'm by no means a Lenin scholar, but I don't think Lenin phrased things in this way, where Spandrell attributes to Lenin the insight that recruiting for your vanguard party from low-status people who hope for higher status if the revolutionary movement is successful, that insight's a stroke of genius because he says it solves a loyalty problem. It identifies, for any political movement, this is true, there is a loyalty problem where,
yes,
in some way, the more competent people you hire or recruit to your movement, and the more options outside of your movement those people have, to an extent, the more their loyalty is suspect. I think it's more complex than he acknowledges. So, for example, you could have someone very low status in your movement whose loyalty might end up being compromised because someone from a competing movement offers them something better.
Mm.
So their loyalty is not as durable as he makes out. Similarly, someone who's high status joining your movement might turn out to be very loyal because they deeply believe in whatever cause you're offering. But look, for now, we'll take him at his word that Lenin's insight of recruiting low-status people to the vanguard party of a revolution is a recipe for ensuring loyalty. If you promise those people a higher status in the society to come, in the post-revolutionary society, than what they currently enjoy. Now, in classical Leninism, those people are taken from the working class. And Lenin said to them, and this is Spandrell's Lenin, I don't think this is necessarily the Vladimir Ilyich communist gospel, but Spandrell's Lenin says to the working class people, look, if you revolt against the Tsar with me, then we're going to have communism. You're going to live in a worker's paradise. Effectively, you will be very high status. And therefore, they support Lenin. And because they're low status in the society in which they currently exist, they become very loyal to Lenin and to the Bolshevik Party. Because what else are they going to do? They're going to go back to being a shit kicker in Tsarism, where they're poor, no one respects them, they have shitty jobs, etc., etc. Biological Leninism comes in the West, where the problem that formal or classical Leninism runs into in the West is that the working class is too wealthy and too comfortable. And so calls to class action or class as an organizing principle aren't effective. But Lenin's fundamental insight, or the insight that Spandrell attributes to him, of forming a vanguard party of the low status remains. Unlike in Russia, where with classical Leninism the low status were people who were poorer and of the working classes compared to the aristocracy. In the United States, those people are the biologically inferior, hence biological Leninism. Now, what qualifies as biological inferiority, I hear you ask? Well, it's...
Why don't you... Wait, before Jack answers, why don't you take a guess, dear listeners?
Yeah, listeners, guess
Just guess.
what biological inferiority entails.
Da, 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 da.
We can play the theme music right now as people think of all of the biologically inferior groups that could be recruited to the biological Leninist
of a neo-reactionary European male who thinks that the West is in decline.
So, chief among these biologically inferior specimens are women. So look, it's over 50% of the population is going to be joining the bioleninist vanguard party, so they're doing well with numbers.
That is very strategic.
You've got non-whites, so black people. They're apparently biologically inferior. They'll be joining the party. Homosexuals, trans people. He calls it a coalition of the fringes. These people who see that under a bioleninist order offers them higher status than the current meritocratic order, and therefore they support the bioleninist liberal order.
Yeah, I actually really like... No, I don't.
You'll love it.
I don't like anything of it. No,
we can end the episode.
I thought it was an interesting way to frame it. Was the coalition of the fringes? I actually thought that was really
that was an interesting
an interesting framing, and I was like, I get what he's saying.
I have read that somewhere else before.
Oh, is it a bit of a meme potentially in the neo-reactionary space?
I think actually I might have even read it in Alexander Dugin's work, but I'm not sure. That term was familiar to me. Take that as you will, listeners. But
Jack's a huge fan of Yavin.
Yeah, look, Spandrell's got a Bitcoin address. I've already emptied my wallet and just sent him everything.
Is Spandrell fin doming you, hey, mate? Getting fin dommed by Spandrell and Yavin.
He bought a nice suit and sent me photos of it without wearing shoes.
Sent you a pair of his worn socks, hey?
His bath water.
Tragic. Where do I want to take this? Okay, so there's a loyalty problem.
Yeah, how about we talk about the loyalty and status bit first, because that's one of the more interesting parts of
yeah. So I was going to suggest that status and loyalty would be two of the key things. So maybe let's I'll just say what the loyalty problem is, and then we'll come back to it. I think because the loyalty problem is basically solved by his theory of status. So the loyalty problem, as Jack sort of alluded to, is essentially how do you make sure that people stay loyal to the cause, to the political cause? His proposed solution to that problem is essentially status. And in one of his in the interview, so there's 3 essays or 3 blog posts and an interview, which is transcription of an interview that he did for another website. And in that interview, he actually gave it a specific name, which he calls status conservation, or the law of status conservation. And with respect to that, he said, in my view, this is a quote, in my view, the fundamental law of the universe is status conservation. People don't want to lose status. Hence, the guy in power doesn't want to lose power, ever. And maybe if we generalize that a little bit more to not just like conservation of status, but status pursuit. So always trying to move up in status. And if you are already up in status or above somebody else in status, trying to conserve it. So it's like non-reversible change of status is entropic.
Yeah. And this might just be stating the obvious, but status is zero sum in that as
What
you
do you
gain
mean by
status,
that?
the status you gain is at somebody else's expense. So status is an ordering in some way of the ability in society to make other people do what you want, of the ability to get resources, of the ability to get respect. And as you ascend in status, you are above the status of other people. There's no absolute status. It's always relative to the status of your peers.
And that's as opposed to positive sum ideas, which is like this terminology comes, just so people know. This terminology, zero sum and positive sum, and there's also negative sum, comes from game theory, which actually informs biological Leninism. So I'll just mention it briefly. Like basically, like a game, say you've got a number of rounds when you're playing a game. At the end of play, so the conclusion of whatever sequence of rounds, you distribute the points, whether in poker it's like the money or whatever. And zero-sum games are basically where there's a finite set kitty prize pool of points, and in order to win, one person to win, the other person has to lose. So in chess, one person wins, one person loses. In Texas Hold'em, one person takes the whole pot, everybody else gets slashed. Whereas in positive sum games, which the classic idea is like mutual exchange, where I give somebody $10 for a sandwich, they give me a sandwich. They wanted my $10 more than they wanted to hold onto their sandwich. I wanted that sandwich more than I wanted my $10. So in the exchange, we both come out better off. And so status, he's basically saying that the drive to achieve more status and conserve the status that one already has, one is obviously a zero-sum game, but two, that's the driving force behind human motivations. He says somewhere else that when he realized that like changed his view on everything, and that it all of a sudden it made his entire understanding of like human history all of a sudden make sense.
Yeah, and this is one of the things in his essays that I don't really disagree with, in that status competition is a massive driver of human behaviour.
Yeah, did you want to add anything to the status stuff?
Yeah, I've got a quote here from him. It's a reasonably long one, but I think it sums up his views of status quite well, and it also brings in biology, which is important. So he says, I think this isn't the first of the three essays. Leninism is, of course, applied socialism. Socialism was huge before Leninism was even a thing, and that Marxism was and is popular is not due only to Soviet patronage. Socialism works by hacking the social calculus module that humans have in our brains. Remember, humans care deeply about status. Status is what drives human behaviour. Everybody works to achieve more status and to avoid losing status. Socialism, of course, sells egalitarianism. It tells people with low status that they can get some more. The Industrial Revolution had forced millions of peasants into the cities, and they all felt they had lost status in the process. Economists will tell you that the standards of living of industrial workers, according to some measures, had actually improved, and that may be so, but the workers didn't think so, and they were pissed. So these socialists come by and tell them that they have this plan to make them gain status big time. That was huge. Yes, sure, Christianity had also started promising the meek that they were morally higher than rich people. They'd all go to heaven, unlike those perfid rich guys. But that didn't translate into actual real-world status. Socialism was promising actual goods, and so it became huge. It's still huge. It's pretty much catnip for humans. It's instant checkmate. Socialism works not only because it promises higher status to a lot of people. Socialism is catnip because it promises status to people who, deep down, know they shouldn't have it. There is such a thing as natural law, the natural state of any normally functioning human society. Basic biology tells us people are different. Some are more intelligent, more attractive, more crafty and popular. Everybody knows, deep in their lizard brains, how human mating works. Women are attracted to the top dogs. Being generous. All human societies default to a Pareto distribution, where 20% of people are high status, and everyone else just has to put up with their inferiority for life. That's just how it works. So a long quote, but I think that sums up the bioleninist approach to status, or how status fits into bioleninism.
So to expand what Jack was saying, there's also an aspect of communism versus, or like socialism versus capitalism, and Spandrell makes this point like capitalism is really hard to do well in. It's competitive, and you have to be competent to do well in a functioning capitalist society. And so in order to achieve status in a wealth-based society, you actually have to be competent. And because basically what he views as biological degenerates, although surprisingly enough, well done Spandrell, he didn't use the word degenerate.
No, I'll give him that. He's look,
although this is 2017, I'm pretty sure
he's a bleeding heart
2022.
liberal in NRX clothing.
So he talks about why, in particular, anti-capitalist, what would you say, like status ideologies are appealing not to who he views as like the ultimate, most competent, naturally awesome people, white European men, and why capitalism is appealing to them because they're competent and smart, and communism is appealing to all the coalition of the fringes. And he says, quote, "For an unreasonable, maladjusted, weird person, your options are much more limited in capitalist system. Joining a crazy political party which possesses the abolition of the very thing that makes society possible, very likely the best shot they'll ever get at achieving high status in their lives." So yeah, why not communism?
Precisely. I follow that with another quote where he says of Leninism, so classical Leninism, the Leninism in Russia that was appealing to the working class, only peasants and workers were trusted. Why? Because only peasants and workers could be trusted to be loyal. Rich people, or people with the inborn traits which lead to being rich, as an aside, white guys, will always have status in any natural society. They will always do all right. That's why they can't be trusted. The stakes are never high for them. If anything, they'd rather have more freedom to realise their talents. People of peasant stock, though, they came from the dregs of society. They know very well that all they have was given to them by the party. And so they will be loyal to the death because they know it. If the communist regime falls, their status will fall as fast as a hammer in a well. And the same goes for everyone else, especially those ethnic minorities. So in that quote, he lays out that status thesis that we've been talking about for a while, why this vanguard party, whether in classical or biological Leninism, seeks to recruit from low status groups because those people can be trusted to be loyal. Now, Levi, how seriously do you take this? Do you think that because someone is low status and a political movement promises them status, they're very likely to start supporting that movement and they'll fanatically support it? And on the flip side, will people who have a lot of other options be much less amenable to the overtures of any particular Leninist vanguard party?
Okay, that's an interesting question. I'll sort of answer that in two steps. Step one is my personal point of view, which is that human nature can't be reduced to a single variable like that, except in the one case, which is kind of like a bit strange to think about, but the thing that makes humans different, the defining feature of humans is the ability to create new knowledge, i.e. our creativity. And our creativity is the thing that accounts for the immense diversity of cultures and languages and technologies and explanations from, the mythological and religious to now these days we have scientific explanations of the world, the creation of mathematics and the ability to transform the environment around us, and in the nth degree actually transform our own morphology. Like no other mammal. So reptiles can like regrow limbs. Like if you pull off a skink lizard's tail, it will regrow. But no other mammal regrows limbs. But we regrow limbs. But we just don't do it by regrowing it organically. We do it technologically with prosthetics. So, and in the nth degree, like we might unlock things like
Space Marines.
Space Marines and in vivo genetic modification, which at the moment would be an immensely dangerous thing to do. But, I think it's on the cards for the long-term future. So that's the defining characteristic. And that thing means that all other alternative reductions, like status or other people say like religious reductions or can I think of other reductions? Status seems to be one of the main ones. Sex drive. Like you see that from the evolutionary psychologists a lot. They try to reduce everything to basically mating games. Those sort of reductions contradict my thesis, which is the defining characteristic of humans is creativity, and creativity is the ability to do new things. So I think it's just foundationally false. However, that being said, I think that sometimes these things can appear as apparently good explanations, when in fact they're bad explanations. And I'll get into the reason why status is a bad explanation in a tick, other than that direct refutation. But there are bad ideas. Like humans are creative, and we come up with all sorts of ideas. However, most ideas are bad. Most ideas are really bad. And humans act on their ideas. And if a whole bunch of people, if a society has a whole bunch of anti-rational or violent or like bad ideas, and nobody is criticizing those ideas, then bad things will happen. One of which might be like, for example, the incentive to gain status through like political revolution. The reason why status in particular, at least the way that Spandrell is proposing it, is that it's a bad explanation. It's easily variable or easily varied. You can explain anything. And when you can explain anything, it's irrefutable. There's no way I can take completely different human behaviors and twist the status explanation to account for that. So I can say, well, the person who joins the Leninist vanguard is pursuing high status. But I can also say that the monk who completely rejects all of civilization and goes and lives in the cave is like, well, he's also pursuing high status. It's like, okay, well, what community does he have? Well, he doesn't have a community. He is only pursuing the status of his own mind. And so it's just this explanation that can be twisted to account for any behavior that you want, even if those behaviors are mutually like contradictory. So that's my thoughts.
Yeah. And even within the paradigm of status, so I do think status is a major factor in how a lot of people behave.
And I can agree with that.
It's significant.
It's when you take it to a complete reduction.
Is he basically says that it's everything.
Well, he regards humans. So what I'm disagreeing with Jack is when I say reduction, what I mean is you're reducing human behavior to a single like thing.
Yeah.
And essentially saying that humans are automatons, like you put a little status token in the little human automaton and it clangs its symbols and it goes and pursues the status.
Yeah. Whereas there are other motivating factors for humans, and humans aren't automata, but even if you just accept Spandrell's thesis that everything is driven by status, well, plenty of people won't join the Bioleninist party despite being low status in the current society because of the fear of losing status. Well, what if it goes wrong?
Yeah.
There are a very large number of people who aren't necessarily doing that well in how our society is set up, but nonetheless support it because they just might not think about it that much and try to achieve status through established pathways to higher status within our society. So say working at a higher paying job to get more money as a proxy for status. Or they might be aware that they're not doing so well in our society, and maybe these Marxist or Leninist ideas sound good, but what if it goes wrong? I have a family, I've got kids, I can't risk that. So even within Spandrell's human automata pursuing only status paradigm, it doesn't work that well. Or you can basically just explain a whole bunch of things using the same descriptive model, many of which are at odds with each other.
Yeah, which is why it's a bad explanation. But, I do agree with you that, I think anybody who would disagree that status for many people is like a major driving factor. Okay, maybe not the monk, going off and living in the cave, but yeah. And what, he does give like a caveat, which is that to some degree it's relative, that like in different communities there's different. I don't think he gives it enough credence, but he briefly mentions it somewhere. Like a good example would be like if you're in an academic community that values like, I don't know, like being very erudite, and you go and hang out with some rappers or something, you might be low status in the rappers community, but if the rapper comes to your community, that he might not be high status. And so like it's relative to like the social context, the status.
Yeah, status is very much relative. And he also talks about power a lot I think it's in the third essay, and makes a similar mistake. So he seems to think of status as universal and not contextual, which, as you said, status very much is contextual. And similarly, he talks that way about power, about how he says something about how power is absolute power, or it's not power at all, which I just think is a pretty frivolous opinion to hold. Power is so contextual. So I suppose Elon Musk is very powerful today. He has a lot of US dollars, which is a form of
he has
of
a
having
billion
power
of them. He has 100 billion.
But if he went back to a Stone Age civilization, that power is just completely meaningless. The context has changed, and so that power is now worthless.
Yeah, and he also does.
Similarly
he
to
isn't in
status.
control of an army, right? Like,
Yeah.
The commander in chief is more powerful than him, but has less money.
Just wait till all the Tesla cars gain self-awareness and start serving Elon Musk.
That's I think. So can we sort of I personally, I don't know if I should have like gone so much into like my personal disagreement with it, but
No, it's good.
let's take his starting premise as a given now, I guess. So that's what he's working from is the status, what he calls the was it the module, something module?
The social something module that's hacked, social calculus module.
Yeah, the social
Leninism
calculus
hacks.
model and the law of status. Yeah. So that's one of his starting premises.
We can assume the human automaton model of political affiliation, that as soon as one person sees that they will be better served by one political movement, or they're convinced that they'll be higher status, they just immediately support it.
Yeah, which is why, again, he didn't say this directly, but I'm going to kind of fill in the gaps a little bit, and let me know if you think it's unreasonable to do this. But he kind of sees things as an all or nothing zero-sum game between ideologies.
Yeah, that was one of the criticisms I was going to bring up, definitely.
And
he's not a particularly subtle thinker.
No. But if he's thinking like this is a zero-sum game and the people are automatons, they're just going to go to the ideology that offers the most status or the most delta in improvement, the greatest delta, then you can only really have one ideology winning that game in a particular society. If you sort of think about it from his point of view. But yes, that's one thing that Jack notes very, very much here, he's extremely binary and absolutist in his thinking. It's the mark of maybe I'll do an episode on this. It's mark of extremely poor thinking skills.
Yeah. Maybe I'll try to steelman this.
Yeah, steelman it. Go on.
Look, in the third essay of the bioleninist triptych, he somewhat alludes to. So he talks about the slow colonization of the institutions of a capitalist meritocratic system by bioleninists. So instead of launching a revolution, instead they'll just slowly take up positions within the educational system, the judiciary, the media, the entertainment industry, and over time start selling people these bioleninist ideas. In which case, so he doesn't say this explicitly, I'm doing a bit of tea leaf reading, where maybe instead of the human automaton seeing, okay, well, there's this proposed system now offering me higher status, so I'm going to go support it. Maybe lower status people will see media produced by organizations that are now mostly staffed by bioleninists. They'll consume entertainment, again, produced by organizations mostly staffed by bioleninists. They might have gone through an educational system, or their kids might be going through an educational system mostly staffed by bioleninists. And in accepting those views passively, maybe that also qualifies as them supporting a system in which they will have higher status, because those bioleninist ideas being sold to them are appealing, and so in some way they vote with their attention or their wallet or their acceptance. That's a steelman maybe shoehorning in a bit of subtlety.
Let me back that up. Okay, so he has there is one component which will make a little bit more sense what Jack just said. The other term that he used for biological Leninism was distributed Leninism, or informal Leninism. So it's type 1 Leninism, classic Russian, formal, and I in my head I thought like explicit,
the canonical
and
pathway.
organized, explicit and organized. And then type 2 Leninism is distributed, diffuse, not centrally organized, inexplicit. And he terms that, because it's like happening quote unquote organically in society, that's why he called it biological. And in particular, he references this Marxist thinker from Italy, Gramsci. It's Italian, so maybe it's Gramsci. There's this idea called the Long March into the Institutions, which is, I haven't read it, but from what I could glance at on like Wikipedia and stuff, it's basically the idea
for the episode.
Yeah, Gramsci was like just this sort of Marxist thinker, and he came up with this idea of the Long March into the Institutions, which is essentially let's get into the education system, let's get into the media, let's get into like these parts of society and kind of ideologically sort of seize these institutions. Yeah, so that's a little bit more context for what Jack just said. So I while we're talking about this though, Jack, have we still manned him, or have we explained without criticizing this particular point? Because I actually found this a really interesting point.
Which thing? The slow march?
The slow march and the stuff about like, well, how do I put this? As we've said before in the podcast, perhaps he gets points for getting to an interesting conclusion, but the working was wrong.
The working's a bit funny.
And the conclusion is, hey, there's this like large-scale distributed leftist ideological, like the spread of this ideology, which you can see. I think it's reasonable to point that out. Like, there's a lot of stuff going on the last few years, like people who have gotten big reacting against what I guess people call woke now, or postmodernism, or critical race theory, or neo-Marxism, like all these kind of like constellation stuff. And then you've got the people like Peterson or Ben Shapiro, or the crazy ones like what's his name, Alex, whatever.
Alex Jones.
Yeah. So there is this thing about it's like the ideological means of production, i.e. our education system and the media in particular, seems to have in Western countries had a significantly like left, quote unquote, or progressive in the American sense bent to it.
Yeah, I think there is a growing ideological monoculture among the employees of many institutions. I'm just not sure it's attributable to biological Leninism.
Yeah, no.
I'm not saying you think that.
Yeah, so Spandrell's explanation for that is biological Leninism. That's what he's saying.
Yeah.
Whereas somebody else might say, I don't know, give some other like explanation for it. Yeah. And what would I say? So how did we get? So where are we now? We are in a society that is, increasingly run, quote unquote, by progressive leftists who have come up through the education system, taken over the media, and getting into the courts. How did we get here? That was biological Leninism. Will it continue? Spandrell says, yes, it will continue because of the inexorable laws of status. And where will it go? Well, it's going towards a full-blown one-party state. In the US, that would be like
one-party
the
state.
Democrats.
Because Cthulhu always swims left, as Spandrell
Cthulhu
says.
always swims left. Yeah, that's exactly right. That's a really good quote. That's what he says. Cthulhu
yeah,
always
that's quite a
swims
funny
left.
quote. Yeah, so his view, it's interesting you mentioning the development, because he says in authoritarian societies or classically Leninist societies, the leftward ratchet stops. So once this Leninist vanguard party achieves power, it consolidates power, becomes an organ of absolute rule. And you don't get a further leftward drift because they're not trying to appeal to low status people anymore. They just have power. And he says the problem in liberal societies is that liberalism struggles to form a coherent ruling coalition, which I disagree with. I think the ruling coalitions in liberal societies are extremely durable, using ideas such as meritocracy to justify their continued existence, whether they actually warrant merit or not. But leaving that aside, we'll just assume he's right in saying that liberalism can't generate stable ruling groups. Those ruling groups rely on a degree of popular acceptance. And so these political parties operating within a liberal system are always looking for new recruits. And who are the best recruits and the most loyal ones? Well, as we've mentioned before, the lower the status, the better. The more loyal they'll be if you promise them power.
Yeah.
So there's this constant, he calls it a leftward ratchet. In terms of what left means, as with many people, not just even on the neo-reactionary right or the right, just in general, the terms left and right are often so vague as to be meaningless beyond knowing how, if someone identifies as left or right, they might dress, where they went to university, or if they didn't go to university, the sorts of shows they might watch, the newspapers they might read.
Yeah.
Because of that constant need to appeal to more voters, the need to get more people into your party, there's this leftward ratchet that no one involved in the politics of a liberal society is really aware of. It's more this internal logic of the system itself to force a leftward shift. And in Spandrell's telling, that leads to increased participation of women, and particularly childless women over 30 who aren't married in politics, because he sees them as very low status. Non-whites, people who aren't hetero, trans people,
yep.
they're going to get
Muslims.
An increasing degree of representation because he sees them as biologically low status. So they're always going to be courted as political apparatchiks for whichever party.
And when he says biologically low
power.
status, he means like literally like less capable.
Yeah, they're just biologically inferior.
And yeah, and it's interesting as well because this is his explanatory framework for why people who may not otherwise work together end up working together. And the example that he keeps on coming back to is like, take Muslims, they hate gays. Take gays, they're persecuted by Muslims. Why are they working together? Well, it's because they're jointly united under this bioleninist ideology pursuing higher status.
Yeah, and that point is interesting. So why do you have, for example, within one left-wing party, a significant contingent who really, really support mass migration of low-skilled workers, and at the same time, a group of trade unionists who don't want masses of low-skilled workers coming in and diluting their bargaining power for higher wages? So that as with many things in this essay, he will touch on things that are real questions. It's just he then offers an explanatory framework, which is kind of off. Also talking about how the leftward ratchet stops in authoritarian societies. I don't think that's correct because I think it's in the second of the three essays. He talks about how liberal societies use basically the biologically inferior in foreign countries as a fifth column to destabilize those countries from within. Column? So fifth column basically means a group of people within a society or within a group who are from the inside trying to destabilize that system. It comes from the Spanish Civil War, where it's attributed to either Francisco Franco or I think to one of his generals, a telegram where they said that they had 4 columns of nationalists marching on Madrid and there was a 5th column within Madrid ready to rise up. And apparently I think that's the etymology of the term 5th column.
A clandestine group or faction of subversive agents who attempt to undermine a nation's solidarity by any means at their disposal. Thanks, Britannica. Yeah. Yeah, so infiltrates.
Yeah, and then he uses the example of in China, whenever you have someone agitating for greater liberalism within China, it's invariably an unmarried woman without kids over 30 or a gay person or a non-Han Chinese person. And he uses this as evidence to support his claim that these are fifth columnists encouraged by bioleninist Western states. But this goes against his assertion that within classically Leninist societies, that leftward ratchet stops, because presumably within those societies there will exist the constituency for a bioleninist party, people who haven't been given higher status within a classically Leninist society, one which gives higher status to the working class, but not to the biologically inferior. So maybe I'm saying his problem was he didn't go far enough. He didn't say that bioleninism is inevitable everywhere. There's no escape from bioleninism.
Yeah. That's right.
That's right. All right. How about I read this quote and we can talk about this? Because this is an interesting quote in that I somewhat agree with parts of it. He says, "The left always wins, but once they win, they become higher status. Come on, they got power. They try very hard to convince everyone that they're not really in power. No, the forces of reaction are lurking everywhere. We must keep on the struggle. 80% of the left's energy is in producing propaganda about how the right really runs everything. When the left had 90% tax rates, they still talked as if they were in Charles Dickens' world. After 60 years of feminism, affirmative action, and Jews in all resorts of power, the left of 2017 is obsessed with systemic racism, toxic masculinity, and anti-Semitism. Right. So, the part of this that I found interesting was that I do think actually progressive ideals, and when he says the left, I'm assuming he's referring to broadly progressivism, really have been dominant societally, at least for my whole life. To the point where even very large companies, and I don't believe for a second that, for example, Nike truly gives a fuck about any of the social causes that they're advocating for, given that their shoes are made by borderline slaves in Bangladesh or whatever.
Yeah.
Or that every publication whose Twitter profile in the West has a rainbow flag for Pride Week, but somehow doesn't have that in Russia and the Middle East. Even though I doubt those organisations truly care about progressive ideals, they've nonetheless identified that is a dominant strain, or the dominant strain, in Western political thought and just the Western lifestyle, just how people behave in general, and that it's dominant enough that it's a market that they can advertise to and use to sell products. Similarly, when someone really falls from grace in politics or public life, it's because they've violated some progressive cause. It's they've said something racist or sexist. And because I've grown up in a progressive society, I broadly agree with these things. But I still think it's interesting that despite the fact that progressivism really has been on a winning streak for decades, progressives on the whole act as if they're an oppressed minority for believing in progressivism and constantly talk about how they're under assault from all sides, that the right is this indomitable machine that's always oppressing them and preventing them from achieving what they want. I thought at least part of this guy's observation in that quote was true.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I kind of agree. I don't necessarily agree that it's that Cthulhu always swims left. You know that.
No,
that
I don't think it does, and I think that you could have a rightward backlash, and I don't think it's.
Or you could just
that
have
is necessarily impossible by some rules of history that he seems to be laying out.
And we could have a situation where we just correct those errors in people's thinking, and we have neither a leftward swim nor a right backlash, and we just move on to like better ideas. You know, like so. There's or you know, we could just turn into full blown like I don't know, like anarchism or something. Like there's a whole bunch of potential alternatives. I just disagree with his inexorable the idea that he can predict the future using these ideas. So
yeah, it's particularly when someone says that the future is certain.
Yeah.
For not even these reasons, but for this reason, that there's this single factor that will determine the shape of the future to the level of resolution that he's proposing as well.
Yeah, exactly. But on the note of like us in our current political context, it seems as though who said this? There was a really funny quote. I can't remember who said this. The left has already won. They're just walking around shooting the bodies or something like that.
Yeah, they're doing a victory lap.
Yeah, they're doing a victory lap. And like, I don't even really agree with the idea of left and right, but even if I can see that characterization.
Well, that's why I prefer to say progressivism rather than left, because progressivism at least is a bit more specific about what people actually believe.
Yeah,
if someone says to me
like social
left,
progressivism specifically,
yeah,
right?
It's like, what does left mean? Does it mean like a socially conservative socialist like George Orwell? Does it mean like your most obnoxiously woke pseudonymous Twitter user? I don't know. It's so yeah, progressivism Progressivism works.
So they've
better.
won, and they've done a lot of damage, I think. Like, in my opinion. So I know you said I was being idealistic before. And again, I'm not going to make claims about like that the world will become better by like that we will correct these errors in the ideological landscape in the world. So I'm not going to like claim some sort of deterministic prediction. However, I personally had ideas corrected in my head, and not not when I was like younger, but like recently in the last like 2 years. And it did require a lot of effort, and I read a lot, but like I personally improved my thinking, and I think that other people are capable of doing it as well. And that's why, like, I would actually say, that's part of the reason why I do this podcast, and I like doing it is because I think like when we have discussions like this, we're going through this error correction and stuff. I wonder whether or not like this is actually like food for thought, like for our listeners, One of the things that I had corrected in my head was, and I go on a lot about this, about the Popper stuff. Not going to go on a Popper rant, I promise. I'll just mention the open society, the society in which there is a culture of criticism. So dissent is protected. There's freedom of speech, and authorities can be questioned without fear of retribution. That's like the source of essentially all the I don't want to be too absolutist in the way that I talk. The fact that the culture of criticism exists is the thing that allows us to do the error correction and improve our thinking, like whether it's science or ethics or whatever. And and the left, quote unquote, progressivism has been mounting an attack ideologically on the open society. Things like the human rights commissions in Western countries, they're kangaroo courts. So you can have things happen to you through human rights tribunals. They're not actually part of the legal structure of like our country. They're kangaroo courts, extrajudiciary structures that I would say are actually like fundamentally at odds with having like rule of law and like an open society with institutions that respect like the sovereignty of the political process. Things like the Court of Public Appeal, like on Twitter, like cancelling people. That's an attack on the open society. Extrajudiciary punishment, like cancelling people, like ruining somebody's career because of an allegation of whatever it might be, means that person doesn't get a chance to defend themselves in, say, like an actual court. They just have their career wrecked. And it might come out later that, hey, the allegation was false, or there was more to the allegation than was originally claimed or whatever. And so we do actually have a very sophisticated system that's been developed over hundreds of years in countries like Australia. And I'm sure, like, I don't know what your experience has been like in Czech, but in other parts of the world where there's a reason why we have these things, these sorts of institutions. And the fact that people in the progressive side of politics do not respect those institutions and want to go outside of those institutions, in Popper's language, they're enemies of the open society. And it's really, really dangerous. in my estimation.
Yeah,
I'm not saying that it's deterministically we're going to end up in a bad place, but it does need to be pointed out that it's actually really dangerous.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's and I'm not saying you're saying this, that this aversion to the free speech of others is unique to elements of progressivism.
No, it's not.
I'd say it's really the general posture of humanity to respond negatively to beliefs that contradict your own, or expressed views that contradict your own beliefs.
Yeah, that's right.
It's just more prominent at the moment, at least in places like Australia, or at least Melbourne and Sydney. It does. Progressivism's hold wanes when you go more rurally.
And
in the United States, particularly
California,
coastal cities.
Yeah, Portland.
That because, particularly in the realms of media, education and things, progressive ideals really are ascendant. And yes, people can point to, there are people like, say, Rupert Murdoch, who are much more conservative, who do have power in the media space, but that's a guy versus what really is becoming an ideological monoculture within the workforce of many media organizations, for example. But because progressivism's more prominent culturally at the moment, we can get the impression that that's the primary threat to the open society and to making people not able or not willing to express their beliefs publicly.
Yeah.
But I think that's more a function of that they have the levers
at the moment
of power at the moment. And it's a fairly, I don't want to say natural in a normative sense, because I think it's an impulse to be resisted, but it's a natural impulse for someone with power to push back on people who are challenging their beliefs, their worldview, and to an extent the basis for their power.
Yes.
Like
the open society.
If, say, conservative Catholicism, as some of those fairly silly people who are more on the online right, who think that a viable path to political power is campaigning for Sabbath laws or something like that. Suppose they were in power, then we'd be complaining about the tradcaths not letting us say rude things about Jesus or something like that.
Yeah, so to generalize what you're saying, essentially, like, my view has become, and let me know if there's a mistake in what I'm about to say, but essentially, assuming that you're a friend of the open society, at least kind of broad strokes, there might be sort of minor points to discuss, but the open society is always under threat. It's always under threat from different enemies, different sides. And if you map this back to other culturally and historically distinct open societies, the ones that Popper and Deutsch talk about are Athens, but there was Baghdad, there was Florence. Sorry, not Florence. Yeah, no, was it Venice or Florence? And arguably Paris before the French Revolution. Maybe, I don't know if you can make that case as strongly. Where basically, like, at different points of time, and certainly last century in the early 1900s all the way up to the rise of Hitler in places like Germany, where different ideological attacks are mounted against the open society. And in our current context, it seems as though sort of woke progressivism in the 2010s and the 2020s seems to be the major force. It changes, and in the future, if the progressivism stuff gets corrected, and all those people stop being silly and they realize that some of the mistakes in their thinking, there'll be another thing that'll come up, and there'll be another thing, and there'll be another thing, and there'll be another thing, and it'll be different.
Because an open society doesn't feel like a default state.
No, it's not.
A large group of people. And with progressivism, it is interesting. It's to an extent, it feels like a bit of French Revolution syndrome. So if listeners haven't read Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France, I highly recommend it.
I haven't read it.
But one thing that struck me reading him talk about the French revolutionaries was this sense that they felt themselves to have discovered truths that nobody before in history had discovered. And from that vantage point of having discovered these universal truths that were correct in as much as they abhorred religion in, say, a Catholic garb, these truths that they felt to be so self-evident that they assumed a religious character, they felt that they could look back upon history and anyone who didn't hold these views as fundamentally wrong and morally reprehensible because they hadn't been blessed with this knowledge, and therefore they felt they could just disregard the entire past as irrelevant to them. And doing things like listening to the opinions of other people was useless because they'd discovered these universal truths that could not possibly be disputed because they were fundamentally correct. And it was funny reading someone writing about people having a revolution in 1789 and recognizing that same intellectual posture in much of, I guess you call them woke people today, or the less reflective elements of the progressive movement today.
Okay. God damn. I don't just want to be a popper parrot but I can't help it. He's just got really good ideas. So again, correct me if you think I'm wrong, but he has I wish I had the quote because it's actually quite a beautiful quote, but I'll try to paraphrase it, which is roughly, the belief in the undeniable self-evident truth and that we can access it is the epistemological foundation of all forms of authoritarianism. And the basic idea is, if you have access to the truth, then if somebody, and in particular, if it's quote unquote self-evident, especially, then if somebody is opposing you, they must be opposing you because they're evil, and it's your moral duty to do something about that. And it almost inevitably involves justifications for violence. And the relationship between our knowledge and our relationship with epistemology is like a fundamental issue in politics. And a fundamental issue in authoritarianism. I actually saw this TikTok.
The font of all knowledge.
Libs of TikTok. Fuck, she's so good, hey. Libs of TikTok.
Didn't she get doxxed by the Washington Post?
Well, she's doxxed herself now. She just fucking owned it, man. She's a gangster. Yeah, she doesn't care.
I haven't seen that content.
She's really funny. She posted this one TikTok video of this dude, this like progressive dude in whatever state, I don't know, Oregon or something, saying we need to forcibly vaccinate people. He said, we need to do it. It might be violent. We need to pin them down. We need to get the police. And this needs to happen because they are compromising herd immunity. And again, even in something like this particular issue of like, in his eyes, it is a undeniable truth that, say, whatever, the vaccine is something that needs to be done. And those people who are not doing it, either because they're stupid or dumb or evil or whatever, need to have this forced upon their body. And so this is always happening.
Man. Yeah, I never looked into libs of TikTok.
Yeah, it's really funny.
For similar reasons why I've never really looked into those groups about dumbass conservatives. When I say conservative, I mean conservative in the American, not so much Burkean sense. And specifically American, because Americans do much better videos like this than other people. When I'm all for hearing from the fringes, which is part of the animating principle of this podcast, but I want a bit more detail, like Spandrell.
Yeah.
Goes into detail on bioleninism, whereas when it's just a 30-second video of someone being a dumbass, it's like, well, it's a dumbass. It gets really old really quickly.
One of the things I did want to ask you about, I think we've flogged that fucking horse. Hey, you reckon? Is there anything else interesting to say about that?
Yeah, we got so off topic.
No, it's great.
Tangentially related.
So this is why an interesting thing about this idea of judging ideas based on their content and their merit is like, even in somebody like Spandrell, who's like, I think this sounds like a person that I would not like to spend any time around.
Yeah,
not least of all because he thinks
bluntly,
he's genetically
I disagree with
me.
most of these posts.
Like he thinks like I'm a biological degenerate who, So like he doesn't like me.
Yes, it's a very pointed attack on you.
because of my genes. But
I, being
notwithstanding,
a white man, fully endorse all three of these essays. I love it.
Notwithstanding that, sometimes if you try hard, even with somebody that you disagree with or dislike, you can find elements of truth, and in a weird way, like these people, these neo-reactionaries, they've picked up that there is this issue in society right now. I just fundamentally, I like the solution. Their solution is just as bad as the problem they're trying to address.
So it is interesting with this. So I think as a general rule of thumb, it's good to understand that just because a person might be wrong some of the time, or even a lot of the time, doesn't mean they're wrong all the time.
No.
There are still things to learn. And I think just from this podcast, because for over a year now, we've both been consistently exposed to views that we just don't share.
Yeah.
For a sustained period. And
yeah.
I think there's real value to that because...
Do you?
Yeah, I do. I think there
what
is
effect
real
has it had on
value
you?
I think it's really good to be exposed to not things that you disagree with in that, okay, these people operating, say, talking to someone who votes for a party that you don't vote for if you live in a democracy. Something like that is still probably actually more exposure to opposing views than many people have.
Yeah.
But that doesn't go far enough because that person's still presumably operating within the same political framework that you are. If you're both in a democracy, chances are you both believe in the ideas of liberal democracy. But I do think there is real value if you are someone like me who is a liberal Democrat in their first principles.
Yeah.
To read someone like Evola, for example, or to read someone like Alexander Dugin, who provides a sustained critique of beliefs or first principles that you have, but in a considered way, apart from anything else to demonstrate that intelligent people can believe different things to you. People don't disagree with you because they're stupid. They just have different ideas, and you might be wrong on some things. And it also forces you to really examine your own beliefs, being shown a belief system that is just so alien to your own.
Yeah.
So I think that's really useful. And doing something like reading Spandrell, do I want to be reading this all the time? No, I did spend a few hours just flicking through his blog, so it wasn't repellent. But I feel like I've gotten basically everything there is to get from Spandrell. But yeah, still, you look at a different perspective, and I think it's worth really trying to see the world from this perspective that of an opposing view that you're reading. And it makes you either really consider your beliefs or maybe even change them if you just can't escape from some sort of problem you've found with your own first principles.
Yeah, and especially if you go back to your first principles, like I've been having to, like doing this podcast has made me, because this isn't the only stuff that we read for the podcast, right, listeners? Like we also read other stuff outside of the stuff that we're reading for the podcast. Like Jack said, he read Edmund Burke last year. I think you don't. How to put it? You don't want your views, or I don't want my views to become sort of sclerotic. Like for me to read other people's point of views, react, and then double down on my previous. Like that kind of defeats the purpose, right?
Go Hassan Abi.
However, it does provide the stimulus to sharpen and refine one's or my first principles. So if I read, say, for example, Osama bin Laden, that was a good example where he's just operating from such foundationally different principles to me that like reading that was just there's just completely orthogonal way of approaching the world.
Just a right angle.
That is useful.
I think another thing that's been actually quite useful, this is pretty off topic, but
we'll come back to it in a tick.
It's just removed that ick factor from hearing opinions that I don't share. How previously I had a bit of a reflexive, I wouldn't say revulsion, but it was uncomfortable to hear opinions that were too different from my own. Whereas I've just burned the fuck out of that from this podcast. I'm so far past the point of feeling uncomfortable when I'm exposed to very different viewpoints. And I think that's really useful because then you can analyze the concept, the concepts presented to you, or the contents of a particular train of thought more on the basis of their merits. I won't say exclusively on the basis of that. I think the passions are always going to find their way into reason. That's not like, Hume acknowledged that centuries ago, but you can at least reduce the impact of your own particular passions on evaluating whether someone's ideas are worth really considering or not.
Yeah, 100%. I think the repulsion or disgust reflex, or it could even, for some people might be more like fear or hatred or aggression, like these kind of negatively valenced emotions in response to points of view that are at odds with your own. Getting that under control is really important, even just for the selfish purpose of being a better thinker, which is a powerful tool, right? Unless you're living in, I don't know, a society that really, really, really only values like physical attributes or whatever. Like thinking
in which case you're definitely listening to our podcast. and
if you're hanging out with what's that fella, the big dude who just screams while he lifts shit like 2 inches. the Greek
Kyriakos Grizzly.
If you're Kyriakos, then maybe you can disregard what I'm about to say. But like a marginal improvement in your thinking will get you a long way, and suppressing those negatively valenced emotions in response to opposing opinions will help you improve your thinking.
Anyway, we were talking about biological Leninism. I'm quite proud of us that in an episode on biological Leninism, we've just, for the most part, avoided all of the sexism, racism, anti-Semitism, homophobia, etc., and talked about ways to asymptotically approach the truth as human beings. That's good. We've used these essays as a jumping off point to something probably a bit more constructive than biological Leninism.
Okay, well, if we bring it back on topic, I've got a thing to talk about, which is signaling. He talks a lot about signaling. In fact, that's one of his core tenets. He calls it signaling spirals, and it's a huge part of his whole philosophy. Do you want to give us an intro to that topic? I'll see if I can find a quote, maybe.
Was signaling spiral from the bioleninism?
No, that's a separate thing. No, I'm just talking about like more generally. It's a big part of his thinking, even in this book. I mean, even in this.
In the context of progressivism, much of the signaling spiral seems to be this ratchet where there is social capital attached to one person demonstrating progressive orthodoxy in public.
Mm.
So
Even
this can take a range of forms. Probably the most interesting form, actually, that I came across in a separate essay of his was where he was talking about how in our societies there is real social capital attached to victimhood,
yeah.
and that carries with it a certain power.
Actually, we should talk
and
about
when
that.
when someone is thin-skinned or demonstratively thin-skinned, it's actually an expression of power, because in complaining loudly in public to some slight, real or perceived, on some level you're assuming that something will be done about it because you are complaining about it, which implies a power, which I found an interesting observation and not one that I'd disagree with, actually. But okay, so that's, as an aside, an example of some sort of social signal within a progressivist environment that you can get social capital from. And then someone else, because status is relative, sees you ascend in status compared to them. So they're going to signal some sort of orthodoxy so that they either make back the status they lost by you advancing relative to them, or maybe they overtake you and gain more status. And there's no end point to this. It just continues ratcheting.
I can.
Is that what you meant when you talked about signaling spirals?
Oh no, don't worry. Let's just go with this. I just want to talk about signaling in general, with regards to this idea, and it is again, this is one of those things where I can see what he's talking about and why people in this neo-reactionary movement are concerned with this issue of signaling, because there is an argument to make, and I personally make this argument to myself, that if you live in a Western country, like Australia or the US or whatever, it is true that there are issues. Some of those issues were caused by historical injustices against different peoples, communities, ancestral communities, for example, like First Nations peoples, or like slave trade with, Africans or whatever, or like the treatment of India, like under the British occupation of India. Like, there's all these issues, right? And on an unsophisticated level, no, I shouldn't say unsophisticated. If you don't dig deep into what's happening in the world to try to understand, I can understand why people kind of stop there and they go into like victim mentality. And in the nth degree, people who don't think critically about it become really anti-Western. I think anti-Western stuff has been, some people would say it's been on the rise of late, and like internal, the fifth column, so to speak, of Western citizens being anti-Western. But the error in those people's thinking is that we live in that part of the world where now those people are able to participate in the reform of the society and correct the errors. Whereas it is not the case that there are other societies like that in the world currently, nor historically. There's been plenty of other civilizations. A really interesting one, it was like the Persian Empire. Man, like, they treated people horribly. And there was never any point at which, like, whatever conquered ethnic group got to, in our case, so like in Indigenous Australians' case, it's taken like quite a while. It's taken like a couple hundred years, but now these days, like, Indigenous people are like participating in the political process and like have a voice and have a say. And that is that's an anomaly. That's a historical anomaly to have that sort of society. Whereas, like, for example, in India, the Aboriginal people, like the untouchables, the people at the bottom of the caste system, as far as I understand, and I might be wrong about this, but they were essentially like the indigenous peoples before the people who are like kind of like the Vedic ethnic groups, like who are in the upper caste, sort of came down from the northern part of the continent. And that happened 3,000 years ago. So for like thousands of years, there's been this caste system that subjugated a particular ethnic minority. And there was never a point until the British colonized them that was ever even questioned as an issue. So like the complete like denial and absolutist victim mentality of people in the West saying that like the West is like inherently evil or corrupt, it needs to be, we need to revolt against it, turn over the system. They don't understand that we're in the part of the world that is not completely systemically corrupt. We're in the part of the world where the people who have been historically subjugated can actually reform the system. It might take a very long time and a lot of work, but it can happen.
Yeah, I think
and
a lot
it can
of
happen
this
peacefully.
Yeah, this so I should distinguish, you did as well, between anti-Western sentiments outside the West.
Yes.
So I suppose you're anti-Western in Iraq or Syria, I think, yeah, fair enough.
Yeah.
And within the West, it strikes me that much of that self-flagellation within the West about how the West is uniquely terrible is probably within progressive societies the last bastion of socially acceptable white supremacy, because it tends to be white university educated people telling a story or a historical narrative where basically the only actors with any sort of agency are white people who are the ones inflicting misery upon everybody else who otherwise wouldn't, like, to be blunt, otherwise it wouldn't just behave like human beings do. Like, human beings just can get violent. Human beings just can get xenophobic.
It's just false to characterize.
It's just
like that. Like, a really good example is just like, who were the Europeans doing the slave trade with? They were doing it with Africans. Like, chattel slavery out of Africa, the Europeans bought the slaves off African kingdoms. There's different, like, Africa is an extremely ethnically heterogeneous place. There's like heaps of ethnic groups, and there's a long history of different like peoples in Africa subjugating and enslaving one another. so slavery is not like a uniquely European thing or something like that. What is uniquely Western is the fact that we abolished the fucking slavery. That's what's uniquely Western. And so what I find sorry.
Oh, no, I was just going to say it's this interesting worldview wherein, in the name of anti-racism, you construct this story where you only are afforded moral agency if you're white.
Yeah.
To be blunt.
Yeah. Which is like self-contradictory. Like, it's completely ridiculous.
I think it's morally reprehensible.
It is.
But
yeah, it's the same thing you see with women, right? It's like there's an aspect of some parts of feminism that just basically characterize women as not having any agency in their life. And yeah, you can say, oh, there's been issues with like the treatment of women over the course of like history, and still there still is. Except the thing is, how do I put this? Like,
I'm a Valerie Solanas fan.
I'm not going to finish that thought. I will just say briefly that I draw a strong distinction between people who live in the West and who are anti-Western, and people who do not live in the West and who are anti-Western. And the reason why it's such an important distinction is, say, take somebody like Osama bin Laden. Like, he wasn't fortunate enough to grow up in a part of the world where he was like allowed to think for himself, you know. And people like Salman Rushdie, the reason why somebody like Salman Rushdie is such an interesting person is because he got the fuck out, you know. And other people like the person who what was that Muslim woman She wrote Apostate.
Ayaan
Hirsi Ali,
or something
Ayaan
like that.
Hirsi Ali. Like, they're interesting because they started off not being in an open society, and they got out, and they were able to like figure out what was going on, and like they are able to like engage with their community of origin at a very like sophisticated level because of that sort of shared cultural background and that sort of stuff. Osama bin Laden didn't go that way.
In the case of Osama bin Laden, I don't think he hated the West purely because he was not allowed to think otherwise. I think Western behaviour
I actually disagree with what I said. Yeah, you're
the
right.
area he considered his home was pretty provocative. I'm not saying this to justify 9/11 by any
Deutsch's
stretch, but
explanation would be
his hatred of the West was not totally unfounded.
Well, I should say, it wasn't that he wasn't allowed to think for himself. It's that, it's kind of, that's a little bit true. It's very like authoritarian culture, but like, but that, say like Ayaan Hirsi Ali and Osama bin Laden both have this human capability to be creative, which is what I was saying at the beginning of the podcast. One of them used that creative capacity to question the authoritative knowledge and that sort of stuff. And one of them used that creativity to actually amplify the authoritarianism and to recapitulate and actually more strongly embody those ideas than his contemporaries. Like, he went further than the other people in that direction.
Yeah. And I guess ultimately it depends on what you're trying to optimize for.
This is problem solving.
He had a, I don't think that's a universal good. It consistently leads to results that I like, probably given my upbringing, but
oh no, what I'm saying is he was
society is
trying to problem
ultimately a
solve.
tool.
He failed.
Yeah.
He didn't come up with the solution to the problem.
Yeah.
But he was trying to solve problems for him in his life. Things that he
Yeah, he
identified as
was
problems.
trying to problem solve.
So my only point, my only point was that I there's a special place in hell for people in the West who hate the West.
I don't know. I think you can definitely criticize the West, but there's a certain type of person who
It's going to
seems
become
to
really
take,
black and white with my thinking.
who seems to consider themselves uniquely brilliant because whenever they'll meet someone who's, I don't know, like they'll meet a Czech person who's proud of being Czech, and they'll proudly tell that person about the slave trade and assume that because a Czech person's white, their ancestors had extensive slave colonies or something like that. Or they'll present a vision of the world that the West is this uniquely bad place, but this individual telling you this is uniquely good because despite the fact that they are Western, they recognize this. And those sort of people are weasels.
Yeah, it's the ability to drop this like nuke on a conversation or whatever. And a normal, like not normal, but like a reasonably polite person won't tell that person who's doing that status signaling thing to fuck off.
Yeah.
But it's a completely antisocial way to have a conversation with another person, don't you think?
Yeah, well, I don't think sociability is the intended purpose.
No.
Of those sort of techniques.
So we
pure
agree
status signaling.
with Spandrell about this being a fucking issue.
Yeah, well, that's the thing with Spandrell. More broadly speaking, really, most of the stuff we read on this podcast, to varying extents, so this doesn't apply to Call of the Crocodile, but like most of this stuff, they're writing in response to something. They've seen a problem that they feel strongly enough about to, as you said about Osama bin Laden, they're trying to problem solve. Like Spandrell's trying to problem solve. And to an extent, he has identified a problem or a cluster of problems. It's just his explanatory model for those problems is, I think, a bit cuckoo.
It's false. Yeah, he has a false explanation.
Yeah.
On that note, okay, are there... Oh, sorry. Bell, do you want to just give me a tick?
All right, while Levi's getting the door, I want to say he brings up this idea of the invisible hand of power. So the invisible hand is a concept, to my knowledge, first put forward by Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations, although, as with many of these things, it might have been said earlier and it's just been erroneously attributed to him. However, I've read The Wealth of Nations and I have seen him use the term invisible hand to describe how higher order economic effects can come about, a general increase in wealth, for example, through the action of multiple individuals in a decentralized manner, all pursuing their own personal self-interest. It leads to economic emergent phenomena as if by an invisible hand or as if directed by an invisible hand. And he talks about the invisible hand of power, how the analogy or the parallel he draws between Adam Smith's notion of an economic invisible hand and the invisible hand of power isn't perfect. It's a bit shaky, but he basically says that if there is available power to be grabbed, it will be grabbed. Not actually totally sold on the calling that the invisible hand, but I suppose by invoking Adam Smith, it makes him sound more erudite, and so he'll do that. So if there is power available, it will be grabbed. I think broadly speaking, yeah, that's true. And he says that this applies for individuals just as much as it applies to organizations, perhaps even more so for an organization than an individual. And basically through this, I only bring it up because this feeds into his idea of the inevitable leftward ratchet. So this invisible hand of power is what is driving political parties to seek out the biologically inferior members of society to staff these parties, because these members of society will be all the more loyal for their biological inferiority. What else do we have?
So can I just say, sorry, I was able to listen to you because I had my headphones in whilst
cool.
I was grabbing my book. Book just arrived in the mail. Thanks, Uncle Jeff.
Papa Jeff.
The key part of that Adam Smith idea, and you actually see as a Bitcoin person, one of my criticisms of the Bitcoiners,
as a maxi,
the maxis, is unfortunately even Breedlove does this as well. Is the key word in the phrase about the invisible hand is actually as if. The immediately beforehand,
as if by an
invisible hand. Smith was using an analogy. he was not saying there is.
it's metaphorical.
It's a metaphor.
It's not physically there.
What he's saying is, I prefer the way that Hayek puts it. Hayek puts it that we have an emergent social order that, much like a designoid object, like a living organism, the knowledge to create that organism's body has evolved over the course of a very long time, and it is a false theory to say that it is designed by an external consciousness. It has the appearance of design after the course of a long process of natural selection. Almost analogously, the complex economic system in which we live appears as though it has some sort of design to it. But again, that's because of a long, complex history of selective processes, such as like the market processes, selective process. Businesses go out of businesses. If they don't do well, the businesses succeed, scale up, that sort of stuff. So we have an emergent social order. It appears as though it is designed. It is not designed. It is not engineered.
Yeah. Yeah, to that point, in quite simplistic terms, really, if something, the phenomena which persist. Like the phenomena which are still present are those which have been able to persist until now.
are those ones that were fit for purpose. So the issue is like design, something that is designed well is fit for purpose. But the thing is, something that has survived through a selective process is also fit for purpose. However, it is fit for purpose because all the variations that were not fit for purpose were killed off. So at the end of the selective process, after many iterations, the thing that's left over has the appearance of being designed because it is fit for purpose. But this is all we're saying is that there's essentially that there's at least two different mechanisms by which an object can become fit for purpose. One is a conscious, like teleological, we designed it, and the other one is iterative selection.
What else do we have to say about Spandrell? Because we keep going way off, like not totally off topic. And I think these conversations are good, but
I wanted to talk about
how much more of Spandrell is there?
Okay, so a minor topic and a more major topic. The more minor one is he commits this fallacy called the Moloch, the Moloch fallacy. Moloch, Moloch god, I think. Moloch.
Isn't the god a
Canaanite god?
Embodiment of violence or something?
Yeah. So the Moloch fallacy takes roughly this form. There is some force, which we'll call the Moloch, that imposes its will upon the people, and the people act as automatons in accordance to the will of the Moloch. And this mistake comes up all the time. One example is like the Moloch of people. Like the planet will inevitably be destroyed by late stage capitalism because people are on a local level doing what's in their self-interest, but then that aggregates up into things that are globally destructive, and that cannot get that positive feedback loop cannot be broken because the individual incentives are aligned to keep on doing that indefinitely. And the Moloch there being, like some sort of pseudoscientific theory about economic incentives and quote unquote rational behavior. The problem with all Moloch theories is that they treat people as automatons reacting deterministically to predefined, predictable criteria. And as I've said so many times in this particular podcast about creativity, that's just false. One, the environment changes and people respond to the environment. And two, when people identify a problem, they can fix it. You know, a really good example is like a bunch of people think that there's a big issue with like, say, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So they're mobilizing billions and billions of dollars to try and like change the energy system. In this particular case, his Moloch, I think, correct me. Well, firstly, what do you think of that, Jack? The idea of the Moloch.
Yeah, I think applying that to Spandrell is not unreasonable. It basically saying that it's even more basic than that. How he argues, and this is quite common for people that we cover on the podcast, is that he proposes a very simplified world model, and the agents within that simplified world model have a very limited set of responses to any sort of stimulus, and a set of responses that don't necessarily correspond to the exterior world.
Yeah.
And within that model, like that very specifically established model, you can observe the sort of outcomes that serve as evidence for whatever the author is trying to tell you.
Yeah.
And it might be internally consistent. However, the wheels fall off when the author then claims explicitly or implicitly that this particular model corresponds to the outside world.
Yeah.
And so with the Moloch example you used previously of late stage capitalism, whatever that means, inevitably it's one of those, sorry, it's another digression, one of those bullshit terms that doesn't mean anything. It's a mood. It contains nothing intellectually. It's just like your bad mood is not an intellectual current. Like when someone says late stage capitalism, I kind of have a feeling for what they mean, or perhaps more accurately, I have some sort of intuition about how they feel, but not necessarily what they're thinking.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah.
But yeah, like the Moloch in that situation exists because someone has created this super simplified model, basically run the model, and it's spat out the result that they like that supports their argument, and so they say, okay, see here, this is true. My model says so. It's making a bad model of the world, which gives a bullshit answer that you want it to give.
In the first place, it's like you finally found a mechanism by which you can argue the thing that you.
I feel like
believe.
I took your question and just ran in the opposite direction with it.
No, it was great. It's fine. I just think that he has a Moloch. He has his entire philosophy is there's this leftist Moloch, and he's kind of like he's just giving the mechanism for it. And the thing is with the Moloch stuff, and in particular with Spandrell's ideas, is like what he is doing is he is creating an explanation of why the world is the way it is, and then making deductive predictions based on that explanation. However, he does not attribute the ability to do that to other people. And he attributes only the ability to seek status to other people.
Yes.
And he doesn't think that maybe people are acting the way they are because they too have got explanations of the world and are creating deductive predictions based on that, and normative inferences about how they should behave. And it's just that those other people have different explanations of the world than he does.
Yeah. I would say the most likely explanation is that this is the one guy with any sort of intellectual agency in human history.
And this is why these sorts of people we've
just stumbled across his blog.
These people always just stink of arrogance. These people.
Yeah, that's something that does put me off any thinker when they get a bit too arrogant.
Well, I have not yet come across a historicist, and I think there's like a modern like historicist, the interpretation of the word historicist. So I apologize if you're a historian or historicist and this is not what you mean. But like at least those people who are trying to find quote unquote laws about human nature or about historical development, and then like Marx, Evola, this motherfucker, like they all have this, I don't know what Spengler like there's just this fucking arrogance to it. And the arrogance is just made worse by the fact that they're just wrong.
They get shit wrong. Well, it means that it becomes harder to really do the intellectually valuable thing of take things from those particular worldviews that seem to be correct. So, for example, with Marx, I'm far from a Marxist.
Yeah.
But at least in terms of some of his descriptions of the world and some predictions are not outrageous. So
no, they're interesting.
The idea that you say the internal logic of standardized parts, standardized jobs, and each person working on, say, a single object in a process. So I'm the one who attaches wheels to cars rather than someone who makes a whole car. He said that the internal logic of that could lead to people becoming, I think in his terminology, fleshy cogs.
Yeah, alienated from their work.
And
right?
becoming alienated from their labour. And I think actually that does describe quite a bit of the 21st century economy in the West. Like he said plenty of things that were, I think, fairly reasonable, or have at least he's made predictions which actually were reasonably accurate.
And he pointed out things like,
but he then proposes a bunch of solutions which I think are completely unhelpful.
And this is why like things can
back to your point.
right?
The issue is when someone's too arrogant, it just becomes harder. At least for me, temperamentally, it becomes harder to acknowledge. Okay, they're being arrogant. They're wrong a bunch of the time, but they're still making some points that are.
It makes it really hard. I find it really hard.
Yeah, and that's something that I have to fight against in myself.
Yeah, because
that when someone's being too much of a jerk, to just think, okay, fuck you, I'm not going to listen to anything you say.
So another minor point in this guy, what's his name again? In bioleninism guy.
Bloody
Spandrell,
Shovel Land.
Spandrell, is
goes by Spandrell or Bloody Shovel.
Is that he constantly does this. He assumes the homogeneity, in particular, of the quote-unquote ruling class. And I don't know if you've got any quotes about this, but let me see if I probably have here.
While you look for
Montesquieu must.
Go for it.
Montesquieu must have thought himself very smart, saying that legislators, bureaucrats, and judges should be independent and in constant conflict. Well, yeah, but where do they send their kids to school? To the very same places. And pray tell, cher Marquis, how do you plan on having those judges and bureaucrats and legislators and teachers and journalists and bankers and industrialists who have all grown up together, shared a secluded life as a unified ruling class? How the hell are you going to make them check and balance each other? That can't work. And it isn't working. They marry each other and send their kids to the same schools. And yeah, they'll do some show and play politics theatre, or kabuki as the Americans like to say for some reason. But in the end, they're an endogamic ruling class, and they know it. And endogamic is just like a social structure where you sort of like marry within a you marry within a particular social group. So
isn't
I think
endogamy? It describes plants that can pollinate themselves or something.
Yeah,
like
but
that.
in the context of
He's using
endogamy,
it literally. He's saying our ruling class of plants
is the practice of marrying within a specific social group. Or it could be the biological interpretation.
I like my way better.
yeah. As opposed to exogamous marriage. Yeah. I would prefer to think that we're ruled by ents. A bunch of ents. Incestuous entish class, the British family.
Getting more and more progressive.
Yeah, so he like... This is just one of those things, and... When I was reading this, I was like, how much time does this person spend with other people? And then
this guy spends a lot of time on Urbit, so I'm going to go ahead and say probably not much.
And then in his
if you're too interested in Urbit and cryptocurrency, you probably don't spend that much time around other people.
Hey, shut the fuck up, man. Fuck you, man. No. I don't spend any time with anybody.
I like crypto and I'm interested in Urbit, so maybe I'll become a social recluse.
In his interview, the fourth part of this series on bioleninism, he literally says that. He says, "Yeah, I don't really spend that much time with other people." I'm like, yeah, that makes sense, because
the man's got insight.
Self-knowledge, hey, is the beginning of all knowledge. So he, I don't know what to say. Like, I've spent enough time around people from different social classes in Australia, including like what some would consider like reasonably elite, based just because of like my educational opportunities, and it's just not the case that they're homogenous. Like and and that they all get along and it's all fucking buddy. If you're from Melbourne, like one of the first things you know is that like you have this like big divide just between like the different private schools. And I personally like think it's a kind of a weird thing, but it's dumb. It's really dumb. But it's just okay, so you went to school,
it also exists.
Scotch and grammar, and it's, you know, in fucking like Scotch College and Melbourne Grammar. In Melbourne, and then they end up going to Melbourne Uni, and they don't interact with each other. or they go to one college instead of another college. It's just like, it's fucking dumb. But it is just factually not true that all these people just hang out with one another. I think this idea is such a bad idea, but it also comes up in other sociological analyses. But from the opposite perspective, we've got this neo-reactionary person saying this is what's happening. But then Marx made similar arguments about the social homogeneity of the bourgeoisie. And you can see straight off the bat, the fact that you can use the same reasoning to justify mutually exclusive claims shows that that is a bad explanation.
Yeah, well, there are a few things at work here. So one, I would say that just the human impulse to tribalize is working against Spandrell here, in that like you can take people from the same backgrounds, who've had the same educational experiences, who've had just about everything in common, and they will form different groups. Like humans just love tribalizing over stuff. I would also, okay, so to steelman this argument.
Yeah. Good. Sorry,
he's saying, okay, so they all go to the same schools, they all consume the same media, they all get the same news, so on and so forth. So that's shaping their views in some fundamental way. And, okay, maybe members of an elite class in a society, they might disagree on certain things, but maybe they'll agree on fundamental things. So
like
in a
human
democracy...
rights or some stupid shit.
Yeah, in a democracy, say the elites, say the members of an elite group who went to Melbourne University or Sydney Uni or something like that, most likely by virtue of the fact that they grew up in Australia and went through the Australian education system, they're not going to be monarchists or they're not going to be fascists.
No, they might be monarchists. I know plenty of young people our age.
Yeah, actually, look, it depends.
But they're not going to be Nazis.
Depends. Yeah, okay, maybe. Yeah, something. Yeah, actually, yeah, monarchist. When I say monarchist, I don't mean that like Australians read gossip newspapers about our queen or now our king.
Yeah, Women's
Charles.
Weekly with the Prince Charles.
Yeah, Women's Weekly.
Sorry, Prince Harry.
Yeah.
More in vogue these days.
But I mean more like
crypto monarchists.
The Australian Parliament should be dissolved and replaced with Tony Abbott. King Tony Abbott.
King Hitler Tony Abbott.
King shirt front Vladimir Putin Tony Abbott. Yeah, so that I imagine that's going to be a minority position, despite the fact that it is objectively the correct position.
Jack and I, what we want is a permanent monarchy of the Abbotts installed. We want cryptocurrencies and we want nuclear warheads. So we are crypto-nuclear monarchists. But neo-monarchists. Yeah. That's what we are. We don't want any of that like homeland British shit. We want Abbotts. We want Tony Abbotts and his crew.
We want a cloned series of Tony Abbotts, so you never run out of Tony Abbotts.
We actually have an eternal leader. We don't even like take his offspring. We just fucking clone him.
Do you reckon it'd be worth just having one Tony Abbott ruling all the time, or if you just had a network of say 1,000 Tony Abbotts?
Well, the thing is,
and just the amount of emergent Tony Abbott phenomena that could arise from that.
We need to replace
for new directions in leading the country.
We need to replace, so we can get rid of the Parliament, of course, right? Obviously, but we still need like a legislature, and a bureaucracy. but we should just replace
What if
everybody
Tony
in
Abbott
there
is just-
with the Tony Abbott. All High Court judges are Tony Abbott.
So what if we
all
even keep
bureaucrats are
elections,
Tony Abbott?
but every single seat is contested
Is a Tony
between two
Abbott.
Tony Abbotts? It's Tony Abbott versus Tony Abbott.
And it's just decided by whoever shirt fronts the other one harder.
Yeah, it's a swimming race.
It's just a swimming race followed by a boxing match.
Yeah. Yeah, I bet our American or just all our non-Australian listeners are really pleased about this.
What a character.
Anyway, yeah, so the decentralized Tony Abbott monarchist nukes and Bitcoin party. That's us. Vote for us in the next election.
This is our platform. And we're just as soon as we win power, we're just gonna step down and install Tony Abbott.
The Tony Abbott hive mind. I think that's a really good idea.
It's fucking fit.
See, Spandrell just didn't predict that that's where the world was going. He didn't foresee the decentralized Tony Abbott, or the Tony Abbott plex monarchy.
Yeah, the hive mind. Tony Abbott hive mind. Fan-fucking-tastic.
Just totally missed it.
So let me see. We've got
I think we need to come up with a system of understanding history that describes why this is
an inevitability,
a historical necessity,
an inexorable law of history that the world is just ruled by a ruling class of Tony Abbott.
Swim left. Cthulhu always swims towards Tony Abbott through Manly Beach.
In fact, it turns out that Cthulhu is Tony Abbott. Hey, listeners, if somebody can jump on the Discord and post in the memes channel, the memes channel is called I Was Born in the Dankness.
I was born in the dankness.
If you can go on there and send us a picture of a head of Cthulhu on that picture from Tony Abbott running in his budgie smugglers up Manly Beach, that would be fantastic.
Tony Abbott's pretty jacked.
Yeah, he was back in the day. I don't obviously know what he's like now. I don't spend my time admiring his chiseled abs.
No, I want to have a look at what Tony Abbott.
But he was back when he was in Prime Minister. Man, he's in good shape.
Tony Abbott shirtless.
I'm pretty sure he was like
23.
Was he an elite athlete? Maybe not an elite athlete, but he was like fairly high level athlete.
Oh, he was okay. There's a website called Hottest Heads of State, which has a bunch of pictures of Tony Abbott.
Really? Is he attractive?
Yeah, a bunch of pictures of him in the surf. Pretty good delts.
Myron, future King Abbott.
A former Prime Minister.
not admiring his like political contributions to the country, admiring his delts.
His delts.
Ziz would be proud of us right now.
Ziz is making a comeback, like not physically, but he's reincarnating later.
Thanks for clarifying that, Jack.
A new generation of online fitness degenerates have discovered Ziz.
It just becomes like this cycle. Like every 10 years, Ziz comes back. As people like
rediscover
another
Ziz.
Generation of 18-year-olds discover the gym. Go onto YouTube, discover hardstyle and Ziz.
Anyway, I feel like if we're discussing Ziz and Tony Abbott's delts, then we're probably reaching the end of our conversation on bioleninism.
There's a couple of last points.
Okay.
The other topic was genetic reductionism.
Yes, this is fairly central to his thesis.
This is incredibly central to his thesis. There's a lot of central points, and it's taken us a while to get to this one. Genetic reductionism or determinism he's basically just saying a particular type of person should quote unquote naturally be in a certain part of the social hierarchy because they're genetically determined to be like, say, incompetent or like not as good at things as, in particular, like in his opinion, white men. So I've got a quote, and he relates this to like status and stuff. Quote, there will always be low status people because there's always biology. Some people are tall, some people are short. Some look good, some are pretty ugly. Some are thin and some are fat. Some are pleasant, some are annoying. Some are cool and some are awkward. Some are smart and some are dumb. Some make good choices, some make bad choices. Some are law-abiding and some are criminally inclined. The latter of each pair is going to be low status anywhere on Earth, even in Soviet communism under Commander Trotsky. Some people just suck. That's the way genes work.
Yep.
Is that the way genes work, Jack?
So the thing is, yeah. Well, the thing with this is, like, there are glints of truth amid like just things which aren't true, which is why,
Yeah.
well, which is why you have to think. It, like with most things he says, there will be elements which are true. So for certain roles in society just are biologically determined. Like, I'm not going to be a basketball player. I'm 5'10". It's just not happening. But he'll take certain more concrete examples like that, and then from that extrapolate, if you're a woman, you can't lead, or if you're not white, then you don't belong in an intellectual job or something like that.
Yeah.
He does. What was it? He did actually. I forget which essay it was in. He mentioned that. So the patriarchy exists because it's natural, and he does this thing of conflating natural with something being correct. Which, given that I'm not totally sure on what basis any of my beliefs really rest, I'm still trying to think that through. I can't definitively say is false, but I don't think that something happening commonly in nature just makes it right. But he says, okay, so throughout history, any society where there's a group of white men, the white men have dominated. I'm not sure that's true historically, but like just for the purposes of this, we'll just accept that and say fine. And he says, okay, so therefore, it's natural and to an extent right that the white patriarchy exists. And then he goes on to acknowledge there are some men who are just not very talented, who do get some residual prestige or status from that. And no, that's not right, but like that's just a side effect of the natural way and therefore the right way of things, that you will get the odd white guy who's not particularly clever but has that halo effect of being white, so he'll get more status in society.
Well, I don't know, like maybe not these days, man.
It's very contextual.
Yeah.
So he does this thing, and I see a lot of progressives do it similarly, where I think I brought this up earlier, because they see that some person or some group has status, prestige, and power in certain situations, they just decide that they have it in all situations. And conversely, because someone might not have much power in a certain situation, they have it in no situations. So they see, then say, okay, when interacting with the police force, being white probably just is an advantage. But people will look at that and go, okay, because someone is in an advantage there because of some characteristic they have, therefore they are at an advantage everywhere. So, for example, at Melbourne Uni, I think in certain situations being white puts you at a disadvantage. And so because power exists in certain contexts doesn't mean it exists everywhere. And that's a mistake that I see Spandrell making.
Yeah, Thomas Sowell has a good book, which my friend just got me, but I haven't read it yet, but sort of at least a high-level idea just from listening to Sowell talk about it. It's called Black Rednecks and White Liberals. And he basically just completely dispatches. The book is basically dedicated to dispatching this way of thinking, whether it's like liberal, like Thomas Sowell is very critical of progressivism, but the same thinking applies to Spandrell's argument because both the liberals and people like Spandrell are operating on the same bad explanation of the world, just using it to justify alternative interpretations. And the basic idea is that you can, in fact, correctly infer these sorts of social structures from something like race. Like, it's just not true. So a good example would be like, white people have power or white men have power. And it's like, yeah, what about rednecks? Like, we don't even think for a second. Like, nobody even thinks. I've pulled people up with using the word redneck. Not pulled them up. I said, like, I don't really like that word. And it's because when you actually think about it, it's actually it's a very derogatory thing to call another person. It's just like this. It's socially okay to just like, okay, there's this. Say in America, like there's this underclass of poor white people who it is socially okay to just shit on them, and not just like socially okay in like just an informal setting, like in mainstream media, like on late night TV shows. Like you can't make fun of poor African American people, or in Australia like poor Aboriginal people, but you can shit all the fuck over poor white people, and people don't give a fuck. But last time I checked, poverty, the suffering inflicted by poverty doesn't change based on your skin color. So we do have these, like, this is just a really it's just false.
I guess
it's just false.
It's what happens when it's when your model of the world is just binary.
Yeah.
Like when you have a just such a low dimensional view of the world that basically your measure for success is yes or no. Like, is this person of this color or not? And yeah, if you're working with that simplistic a model, you're going to get all sorts of really, really silly stuff.
This is a conspiracy theory, but it's not quite. It's not quite a classical conspiracy theory where there is a definite group of actors, known or unknown. Like some known conspiracy theory actors are like, say, the Clintons. They're the ones that are bad. Whereas other conspiracy theories, like some of the Ike stuff, is more like there's a cabal, a shady cabal behind the scenes. Like we don't know who they are, but there is definitely a consolidated group of actors.
Yeah.
Whereas this is like, I would almost call this like there must be, if we could do like a typology of conspiracy theories, this particular one would be kind of like a diffuse, decentralized conspiracy theory, and I think they're probably related to the Moloch stuff. Yeah. And why I say it's conspiracy theory, even though he doesn't say that there is actually like a specific group, what he is saying is that this ideology has permeated out over the decades through the education system and so forth. And now these people are acting, like the leftists, are acting, if not in an explicitly coordinated fashion, in like an ideologically unified fashion.
Yeah. He describes it as a memeplex, I think, in the third blog post.
Yeah, he calls it a memeplex.
He seems to be proposing a mechanistic view of history whereby it really doesn't matter what different groups do in terms of their organization or whether they, like, who tries to grab power or not. There is a leftward ratchet and it's inevitable.
Yeah.
And that's a historical necessity. It's almost, I wouldn't say an anti-conspiracy theory, or almost this decentralized, inevitable conspiracy.
Yeah, which is what these sort of mechanistic ideas of historical development almost inevitably lead to, is a diffuse conspiracy.
Yeah.
In a weird way. Yeah, I don't know what else to say about it except that that's what it is.
Yeah. Would you recommend it?
The conspiracy? Yeah, get around it.
No. Would you
Join
recommend someone
Cthulhu.
read?
We're swimming left, boys.
Yeah.
Would I recommend this book?
The bioleninist troika, the triptych of bioleninist thought.
This is my first exposure to neo-reactionary thinking, and unless you count, this is kind of BAP adjacent, isn't it? And Mike Marr adjacent.
Yeah, this is definitely BAP adjacent,
but it's not exactly the same thing. It seems as though, in my opinion, this guy is a better thinker than Bronze Age pervert, which is not saying much.
More lucid, definitely.
Or more lucid, yeah.
A lot less funny, but a lot
less funny,
coherent.
Yeah. Would I recommend it? Is this guy known in these circles? Like Yalvin's the big dog, or is this really obscure?
Look, it's not super niche within the context of frog posters, but he's not huge. He's not BAP level.
Look, it's weird. If you want to go and read something weird, go and read this guy's. But probably not, unless you just kind of want to gawk at something. The intellectual zoo. What do you reckon?
Yeah, I'd say it's very short. He repeats himself a great deal. I think in the interview he bragged that he writes like Michel Houellebecq does, where he just starts writing without a plan. And I think he probably could have done with a plan, because this could have been like 1,000 words. If you really want to read them, just read the third blog post, the final of the trilogy, and that basically has everything. I guess it's kind of interesting to read and to, if you disagree, verbalize why you disagree, rather than just, I think it's icky. But yeah, look, it's not. This is not necessary. You're not missing out if you don't read it.
Actually, the thing that I was more interested in reading once I looked at his other stuff was his stuff about religion, which I haven't had a chance to read yet. But I would like
making a
new
religion,
the claim that we need a religion for one, and two, instead of like repurposing an existing religion, creating a new one. So that actually I would find more interesting than the bioleninism stuff.
I did read those, but it's 11:43 p.m. my time, so
we don't talk.
We're not going to do a discussion on that. But I would say those blog posts are a lot more interesting.
Okay, maybe we should read those at some point, or something.
Yeah,
similar.
I'll do that.
Yeah, I don't know. It was. Hey man, it provided we had a really interesting discussion.
It was a good jumping off point for more interesting discussions.
Yeah, but he does have systematic errors in his thinking, and that leads him to
fairly fundamental
end up
systematic errors in his thinking
in a very strange place. Yeah, actually, you know what? If you've just listened to this podcast, I don't recommend you reading the original source, because our discussion was better than the original source. Unless you just get a kick out of just reading stupid stuff.
Which is a noble impulse, and
names will probably read it. Fucking good on your names.
So for the next episode going to be your defense against the dark arts?
Special announcement, although we might be able to release Defense Against the Dark Arts before this. Maybe, depending. Let's just see, because we want to start going up to a weekly schedule. So this particular part of the conversation might sound a bit weird depending on when we release the episodes. But yes, I've got a series coming out, Defense Against the Dark Arts, about essentially critical thinking and using the episodes that we've covered to sort of give examples of like errors in thinking and that sort of stuff. Just because we want to try and increase our content and come up with some like original work and stuff. So yeah, stay tuned.
Stay tuned. Then after that, I think we're doing Alexander Dugin's Fourth Political Theory, and I'm reading American Psycho.
And Jack's going to be doing a bunch of solo episodes on fiction books.
On fiction research.
Hopefully, if
if
you're enjoying the podcast, we had a really good year last year. We're really happy with how things went. We're really happy with the Discord. So if you're one of those people that like our stuff, good news. We're going to be trying to increase content output this year.
Yeah, the goal's weekly content output. So if you've made it this far, you can expect more of this in a week. And thanks for making it this far as well.
Yeah, thank you. We really appreciate it. All right, Jack. Any final thoughts?
Yeah. No, that's it.
Join the Discord.
Nah.
Come say hi. Other than that,
Discord.
Thanks for
the Discord's great. Everyone should get on there.
Yeah, it's so good. They're fucking crazy, man. They're crazy. We should probably make some more channels. Give some have a think about it. Anyways, different conversation. Let's get off. Thank you for listening.
See you next time.